Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you. That's what I was looking forward to. All right, we're going to go ahead and get this session started. My name is Randall Mathews. I'm the Deputy Director for Chatham Emergency Management Agency. What's that? Can you hear me now?
Check.
Just have to
Check,
be
1,
right
2.
here. Perfect.
Yes.
I won't move. All right, so my name is Randall Mathews. I'm the Deputy Director for Chatham Emergency Management Agency, and we have a handful of folks here joining me today to talk about the easiest subject of them all, funding. Very easy, so look forward to diving into this topic. We've got all the answers you could ever dream of. If we don't have all the answers for you, it's not my fault. It's the fault of these three up here. So I'm joined here by Kemp. He is the Director of Bulloch County Emergency Management Agency in Georgia. Also have Maggie Steenberg, who is the Assistant Director for Miami-Dade. And then also Manuel Laboy, who is the President for NovaForge Consulting. So please welcome our attendees here. Perfect. So, as you may or may not have noticed, funding has been a little bit dynamic over the last year or so. So we're going to dive into some of those challenges. That's not the only thing that's dynamic in the emergency management world. For example, in this last session, the DHS Secretary, Noam, was fired. So, yeah. Yes. So... It's very dynamic times. So, all these funding solutions that we had, that are going to present to you may be null and void once a new secretary comes in. So I don't know. But yeah, just want to tee things off with that. But as we open up this panel, I just want to get some of the thoughts here for the funding preparedness. So when we look at preparedness, response, and recovery, where do you see the biggest funding gap today? So, Corey, you want to lead us off?
Sure. Can y'all hear me? Yes. Okay. For me, Bulloch County would be the smallest entity of the three. So for me, it'd be access to grants, but also the cost share that goes with those grants. Most grants have a cost share anywhere between 15 and 25%. So it will be up to my community to figure out that cost share and how we will pay for it. And lastly, it will be the requirements of the grant. Do we meet all the requirements? And also, well, one thing I forgot is the workload of the grants. I'm a one-man show. Can I do all the work myself to get that grant and complete it?
All right. Keeping with the theme of the conference, I think it's definitely not a surprise that one of our biggest challenges or funding gaps that we face today is the constant need to do more with less. As emergency managers, contending with bigger, stronger, more frequent, more complex disasters and incidents while actively being squeezed with our budgets, elimination or curtailing of grants, cutting staff, and just generally, scaling back of resources. So the doing more with less, which is obvious to everyone, but also the sort of downstream challenge of having a lack of dedicated local capabilities to fill that gap or to meet those challenges that are going to be left vacant once the funding is reduced.
I completely agree with the cost share comment. That is a big deal once you have declared disasters and you have to come up with non-federal share. And I also agree with the local capabilities. Most of the state or local governments, even nonprofits, they are having shortfalls in terms of making sure that they do have that capability in terms of facing multiple disasters consecutively. I would like to add 3 items in particular that I have a lot of experience with, and I fear that if governments, especially state and local governments, if they don't really act on this, it will just exacerbate situations into the future for recovery and response. Number 1, the private insurance obtain and maintain requirement. That is a big deal in terms of how the industry profile for insurance and facilities that are insurable versus FEMA's requirements associated with that. And let me remind you that once you go through a disaster and you have a requested public assistance and you do receive an obligation, to repair, restore, or replace that facility that was supposed to be insured in the first place, after that, there is a baseline requirement, and that money will be used in the future for another declared disaster for the same facility. And I've seen a lot of gaps when you have to go to the market, that local government for that facility or state, and there's not enough capability of the insurance system to actually insure that. And there are ways to handle that, but that one is a big one. Number two, remember that FEMA doesn't pay for maintenance issues, right? It's associated, they're gonna give you money to address actual damages that you can validate, and you agree upon that. And I've seen issues with budgeting for proper maintenance. And like, I'll tell you this in the case of Maria, for me, it was like, an opportunity for a clean slate, and there were no, all the maintenance records were damaged, and there was nothing on the cloud back in 2017, at least for the most part. And there was a break, I will say, right? There were certifications that were issued to try to demonstrate there was some sort of maintenance, but after that, there's no opportunity, there's no other chance. You have to maintain the facilities, and you need to demonstrate that with the proper records. And finally, the rainy day funds, right? You have to be able to finance a proper response, preparedness prior to that, and a proper response. Hopefully, you will get a declared disaster. Eventually, you will be able to get reimbursed, but you need to address all the activities associated with saving lives and protecting property. A rainy day fund at the state level is super important. I'll tell you this, in our case in Maria, there was zero money for rainy day fund. 5-6 years later, we'll be able to actually accumulate $1.2 billion over a rainy day fund. That made the difference for Fiona and hopefully for subsequent disasters. So rainy day funds are also important.
All right, thank you for that. Manuel, you talked about budgeting as part of your response there. Could you kind of share some of your experience as to what financial metrics would resonate most with those elected officials and finance directors?
Yes, I think the number one, I mentioned this, right? You have to be able to demonstrate that you are being responsible, in terms of insurance and maintenance. But from the perspective of preparedness, I will say that you need to be, able to effectively demonstrate that you're being very efficient, doing more with less, I guess. You have to demonstrate that you know what you're doing in terms of, ensuring that you have your shelters properly maintained, that you do your tabletop exercises, that you actually do your training and outreach properly, that you actually collaborate and cooperate with other dependencies like public works in terms of doing field inspections. In my experience, when you go to that level of detail and you demonstrate that you're really on top of your game, and you demonstrate that you're being very efficient with what you have, that resonates. And number one. And number two, this is very important, readiness for reimbursement, right? Documentation is extremely important, but you also need to have your policies. I mean, we always talk about updating plans, and that's very important, right? You have to have your plan updated, and it has to be an executable plan in terms of responding to and eventually starting our initial recovery from a disaster. But remember, it's all about policies and procedures and guidelines and systems. And I've seen a lot of mistakes made by state governments, by local governments, and even nonprofits, is that they're not really ready to do initial damage assessment. They're not even ready for a preliminary damage assessment. They're not ready to submit something as simple as a request for public assistance, right? So you start spending money, and it's probably so. You demonstrate that you need to save lives and protect property, but at some point, financially speaking, you need to be very responsible with that. So I will say that when you talk to, about metrics, you need to demonstrate that you are, let's call it, you're ready for reimbursement, right? You're gonna start spending a lot of taxpayers' money on the state and local side. You need to be ready. If there's a declared disaster, they will be able to recover that.
All right, thank you for that. Corey, you had talked a little bit about some of the challenges as a one-person shop. So how can smaller or under-resourced communities improve their grant writing and grant management capacity?
Yes, so first let's look at the purposes of grant. It's to prepare, respond, recover, and mitigate. So when we talk about my office, since I'm that one person, I had to learn how to collaborate with others. Sometimes I've taken the grants and just did them myself, but I've learned today that collaboration is good. But also stop thinking narrowly. When you start thinking of these grants, just open your mind out from a 40,000-foot view and just think of everything that you can get under a grant, not just a simple generator. If you can Google mitigation risk grants, it should come up with different states where they created a whole list of things you can ask for under grants. Create one for yourself. Also, look at your resource requests that you have requested from the state. That'd be a good way to get things that you need. But also talk to regional partners about grants and how they apply for them. Use tech college assistance, also other, I'm not going to just say tech colleges, but also other universities. College students are very willing to help where they can. If you have some classes or know instructors that teach grant writing classes, utilize those students. Some of them can use it as college credits. I had an intern I still have an intern until next week. I have an intern that will help me write grants. Grants is not her thing, but she enjoys learning. So that is one thing we can do. But also call your friends. They also have wrote grants before, and I'm gonna say they don't mind helping, right? Okay, awesome. But also, if you can find a grant writing company that will come to your community for free, just to get their name out there, call them and set it up. And that's it. You want to add to it?
All right, Maggie, I think you had some thoughts on this as well.
I did, yeah. So this is, Miami-Dade is obviously not a small community comparatively. We have about 3 million residents, so a little bit different in terms of size and resources. But you know, even being the largest county in the state of Florida, we still struggle with some of these challenges related to capacity for grant writing, and how to position ourselves to be most competitive for these. And some of the things that, you know, I find, you know, just at the onset of this, right? I think people need to get comfortable with reading funding opportunities, NoFOs and NOFAs. And what I mean by that is we have a lot of information that's always being thrown at us, and there's this real tendency, I think, to skim the headlines or to read, you know, the subject line of something and then get yourself all twisted up needing to act without actually first digesting what it is and reading to identify, does this opportunity even apply to me? Am I even eligible? Are there requirements in here that I have or don't have? And more importantly, are there opportunities for management costs, right? Or could I hire someone under this grant to help me? Is there money for planning and for scope development? So I think a lot of times we see the headline and then we just jump really quick, and then we get ourselves all down the rabbit hole before we've even stopped to figure out, does this even work? And I get this all the time, even being a large jurisdiction. Our elected officials will see a press release. This happened recently with the state of Florida, and it said, you know, DHS releasing an additional $480 million in recovery funds to the state of Florida, right? That's the headline that led. And so our mayor, our elected officials, they started furiously sending that to us saying, how do we apply? What do we go after? What do we do? This is our money, right? But like, if you take a beat and you read it, you realize that $480 million isn't a new application. It's simply DHS releasing funds that were previously frozen to applicants who already have projects in the pipeline, and there is nothing to apply for, and there's nothing you can do to change your lot in life. You just have to sit back and wait, and maybe your projects get funded and you'll find out on Grants Portal, right? But again, that was like an exercise in reading beyond that headline and spending a little bit of time digesting that funding opportunity before you start subtasking it out or worrying about who's going to do the legwork or all of this, right? So for resourcing for grants, I think step one is read the NoFOs and look to see if it applies to you, or you can just move on and not waste your time. The other thing in terms of like positioning yourself to be ready, I guess, for some of these opportunities is recognize that even if you are a small jurisdiction, even if you're a team of one, a lot of these preparedness and mitigation and recovery grants have prereqs, and those are things that you need to be working on year round to make sure you're positioned. Do you have an approved hazard mitigation plan? Do you have a CEMP? Did you complete your THIRA, right? Are you an active member of an LMS? Do you have projects on a prioritized project list? All of these like proactive steps that are necessary cannot be overstated, because while you need the grant expertise to write the grants, you need to make sure that you haven't already shot yourself in the foot before the opportunity even happens. So not losing sight of the need to be actively engaged in preparing before the funding becomes available. That's what I'll say there.
If I may add, Randall, I will add that when you are a jurisdiction like Florida, like North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Puerto Rico, USVI, which is very simple to determine the common denominator, you're managing multiple disasters almost at the same time, a lot of overlapping, which means it's a good thing from the perspective of tapping resources to finally address long-term issues, right? Past issues that have been, kind of, in limbo because there's no, financial resources to address them. And finally, because of such a bad thing as a disaster, now you have the ability to work with those. But here's the thing, about capability. Pretty much they are the same applicants, right? The same applicant that goes after the FEMA dollars, the same applicant with the same team looking for CDBGDR and CDBG MIT dollars, the same applicant that is looking for maybe potential new grants. And there is a bottleneck, that's a reality. And when you are in constant mode dealing with disasters, most of the time the same teams, they don't have the ability to look for something else. And I'll give you an example. Pre-disaster mitigation projects, right? In the past, there was a nomenclature for that, and then eventually it was changed to a new program called BRIC in the case of FEMA, and it's incredible because it was dismantled, I think, last year, even though it has bipartisan support, right? Building a resilient infrastructure and communities, right? And when I started trying to push for those opportunities in Puerto Rico, the response that we got from nonprofits, actually nonprofits couldn't just apply directly, but they need to partner with a state entity or a local government. But when I was talking to these local governments or state agencies that could actually present projects against that funding when it was available, the answer was, we're too busy. We just can't deal with what we already have in our plate, right? So yeah, let's go back to capability. And you have to think about ways to manage current loads based on actual disasters have been declared. And at the same token, you have to be some sort of innovative and efficiently to be capable to try to tap to those new opportunities that are competitive in itself, right?
All right, thank you. So as we look at that shift from the federal frameworks and what has traditionally been federal support post-disaster, we look at that greater emphasis for the state and local level. So Maggie, for you, what legislative barriers do you think limit the effective disaster funding at the local or state level?
Oh, well, yes. So I think we've all been tracking the news, and I think everyone's acutely aware of all of the pieces of legislation, or at least familiar with legislation that's either proposed or already happening or working its way through various committees. I think barriers is maybe not the word I would use. I think that there are both barriers and there are opportunities in some of the legislation that is currently swirling. So the FEMA Act or House Resolution 4669, which was passed through the Transportation Subcommittee last year, has not been signed into law, but it certainly has a lot of good nuggets in there. It has things in there that I think will create barriers for local emergency managers, but I also think there are things in there that, if handled properly, could also be opportunities to strengthen our programs or to drive dedicated resources towards emergency management. There's things in there that I think need some guardrails, right? So creating, dashboards for survivor assistance, or having everyone sign up for like single sign up for resources. I think there's some hesitation sometimes for people to be in these databases, but there's also things in there about mandating, that you have a dedicated emergency management program that's fully funded, and that you're investing in risk reduction and mitigation. And the carrot and stick could be a sliding scale for your recovery dollars, right? So the federal minimum of 75-25 would stay, but it would give discretion, for example, to the president to have a sliding scale down to 65 or up to 85 as the federal cost share, depending on how much you've invested in mitigation and a dedicated emergency management program. So that's just like an example of something that's in there that I think has the opportunity to challenge us, because certainly you could be at the 65 end of this and that would suck, but it also has the potential to put a little bit more teeth behind our need for dedicated budgets, dedicated resources, and there's even something in there about needing to have a dedicated like emergency fund, right? Which is something that a lot of jurisdictions struggle with, is getting support to set aside large chunks of money, right? I don't know how many people in the room, your programs are grant funded, right? Or you have staff that are being paid for by preparedness grants. That's not a sustainable way to do business. So I think certain pieces of legislation, they're worth watching, they're worth digesting, and they're worth, interpreting. But I think that, yes, barriers, but also where are the opportunities in that? And I think it's our job as emergency managers, as practitioners of this, to also be active participants in that legislative process, to attend the FEMA Review Council meetings, if and when they ever restart, small asterisk there, but attend those meetings, engage with your professional networks, join the legislative groups that are part of those bodies, right, with IAEM, with FEPA in the state of Florida, NEMA, NACO if you're a county, local, working with your local elected officials who want to lobby on your behalf, right? Dedicate time to being engaged in that process so that you have an opportunity to leverage the good parts of these things, and also be aware of what's coming as a hurdle so that you can get in front of it before it hits.
Yeah, those are some excellent points. Collaboration is certainly key, and then also making sure that you understand the different timelines that are associated with some of these different things. So for example, last year, when there's all these changes happening at the federal level, I went and wrote a piece of legislation for Georgia, the state of Georgia, to go through and develop a disaster recovery fee that would be applied for vehicle registrations. So for every vehicle that would be registered, there would be a $3 fee associated with that. That would be then given to the counties to develop disaster recovery funds that could be used for things like individual assistance if they wanted to start their own individual assistance program. It could also be used for grant matching, when you're having trouble, paying that 15 to 25% match as required. But it's just looking at those different innovative ways to go through and break those barriers. So, the federal level, those systems are changing. So that means we got to do something at that local level. So unfortunately, that piece of legislation was not picked up during this legislative session for the state of Georgia. But I'm going to work on that throughout the course of the next year to make sure we can get the buy-in on that. And that's going to be all that collaboration and partnership. So instead of a handful of people being the squeaky wheel, we're going to have a very large squeaky wheel next time that Georgia legislative session opens up. So for the state of Georgia, legislative session's only about 6 to 8 weeks long. So starts in February, and it's wrapping up right now as we speak. So we don't have a whole lot of opportunity to be dynamic with changing state policy. So we just need to make sure we're leveraging those next several months in that off cycle to work with those local legislators to ensure they understand those priorities and can push that forward. But also you have the opportunities at the local level for local laws that you can enforce and actually do some fundraising from. So for example, in Chatham County, Georgia here, we implemented a fee for our Tier 2 facilities. So all those facilities that have massive amounts of hazardous materials, there's actually a fee associated with that for private industry based on the amount that they're holding. So that does generate about $300,000 each year, and that's funds that can go directly into our hazardous materials response program, as well as fund staffing for emergency management. So things like that, it can be done. If you need to see any examples of that, be happy to share that information with y'all, but that's stuff that could be implemented in the short term just through that local legislative process. Shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about some of the private sector opportunities. So Manuel, I want to talk a little bit about how we can structure both the public and private sector partnerships to benefit both resilience outcomes and private investment.
Thanks, Randall. And very quickly, I wanted to also provide some insight about the legislation piece of the puzzle. Very quickly, be mindful about federal legislation that looks good, but there's a little detail is in terms of whether that will be applied retroactively or not, and that's a big deal because for those of the states and territories that are managing disasters, and then all of a sudden there's a piece of legislation that improve processes, streamline decision making to speed up recovery, doesn't apply to the disaster that you're actually managing. So be mindful about that, number one. Number two, at the state level, also be mindful. I've seen it in Puerto Rico, state pieces, state legislation that they think that they're improving the procurement process for state entities and non-state entities, but in practice, they haven't done the research and cross-references with federal regulation, and they just create a mess, right? And number three, local governments, also be careful when you pass ordinances to raise taxes only for federally funded projects, right? I've seen that mistake. And you just can't do that, right? You can actually increase taxes for construction, for example, for construction projects, right? But you have to do it across the board. You just cannot discriminate whether this is because federally funded or not, right? So I just wanted to highlight those three things. In terms of private partnerships with the public sector, I want to highlight one thing that it was a very personal experience to me right after Maria, right? FEMA, for a long time, had this initiative called the National Business Emergency Operations Center, right? It's called BEOC. And prior to Maria in Puerto Rico, that was pretty much non-existent. It is a great framework. I will recommend it, and I actually saw it in action in Maria, right after Maria. Remember that we were literally an hour after the hurricane struck Puerto Rico. There was zero power. It was 100% blackout. So what did that mean? It meant that no telecommunications. It meant that you might have, actually there was cash in the banks and ATM machines, but you couldn't even access that. There was fuel in the storage tanks at the wholesale level, but there was no way to distribute that fuel. And all of a sudden you have, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of generators running at the same time that were never meant to run 24/7, right? There are emergency generators. There are no parts for that. All of a sudden you don't have parts. So it was a nightmare, and I think that the private sector, when FEMA activated the BOC, that was fantastic. We established that framework. All of a sudden, you have all the key players from the private sector dealing with fuel situation, fuel distribution, dealing with healthcare, dealing with pharmaceuticals, something as simple as, do we have enough nitrogen and oxygen for the hospitals? We are an island like USVR, or an archipelago for that matter. We needed to bring ISO tanks. Regularly, they come to Puerto Rico for nitrogen and oxygen, and there are a couple of small plants in Puerto Rico and medium-sized plants that actually produce that. But they didn't have any power whatsoever. So yes, number one recommendation is make sure that your business, your BOC framework is active, not when there's a disaster, before that, right? That they meet, that they actually have good policies and procedures, that they have great communication, government and private sector sharing data, ensuring that when the disaster strikes, the private sector will be there to support the operations. And number two, think about pre-positioned contracts, right? FEMA allows pre-positioned contracts. And it is a proactive measure to ensure that essential services are readily available in the event of the disaster. Guess what happened in Maria? There were no pre-positioned contracts. So all of a sudden, everybody's looking for fuel supplier. Everybody's looking for parts. Everybody's looking for crews. Everybody's looking for ski labor here and there. I mean, they're looking for, there's nothing in place because nobody was expecting that. In Fiona, we learned a lesson. Of course, Fiona is not Maria, but from the concept perspective, we did learn the lesson. So think about that. You have to have pre-positioned contracts with the private sector or your key suppliers, and you have to have an actively involved private sector in your BEOC. One final comment. If your jurisdiction has a law, a legal and regulatory framework for actual private-public partnerships, when you have a public asset and it's transfer, these operational maintenance and investment through a P3 framework, we have done that in Puerto Rico. So, for example, the toll highways, it's in the hands of a private sector through a P3, so they handle all of the preparedness, all of the response and recovery through that framework. Same thing with the power generation and transmission distribution. Same thing with the ferry systems in San Juan and in the east. And yeah, that's pretty much, the types of, and the cruise port also. The cruise port was recently, became a public-private partnership. So they work, but you need to be mindful that you have to conduct the right process and have the most responsive and smart agreement in order for really count on the private sector to step in. Thank you.
Can I add one thing to the? Okay. Just to add one thing here on and this is not earth-shatteringly new information, but worth mentioning. So when we think about private sector financing opportunities for emergency management, for disasters, preparedness, recovery, et cetera, I think it's worth noting that one of, I think, our responsibilities when we work in this space is to do what we can to move people to the private sector when it comes to things like insurance and risk reduction in order to reduce the dependency on government resources and government funding. Again, going back to the very real reality of doing more with less, I think it seems intuitive if you work in this space, but there are quite a few individuals throughout our country, especially in our very hazard-prone areas and our most vulnerable communities, who are underinsured or uninsured. And that creates a real financial risk for them personally, but also for our broader communities. And that's not a gap that the government can fill. It's never been the intention of the local, state, or federal government to make people whole or to fill in those individual gaps in preparedness and financial resilience. So I think we have to do a much more aggressive and active job of pushing people to get engaged with the insurance market, to understand the types of insurance that are available, to use the private sector to absorb and distribute that risk, because that is what it is designed to do. And that's something that, we do need to reduce that government dependency, that automatic knee-jerk reaction to think like someone's coming to bail you out, because it is not true. And that's my fear, like in South Florida, is, if we got hit with something like Katrina, we would have whole communities that just never came back because they would have no way of rebuilding. And then the ones who did want to come back would get priced out by developers. So it would just be a catastrophe because we are just not ready for that at an individual and household level.
And I like to stress what Maggie said. This whole thing about insurance is a big headache. And in the case of Puerto Rico, Maria is it's a Katrina level event, right? And people thought, the government back then thought that we were properly, covered from the risk standpoint. In reality, there were 5 or 6 major insurance companies doing business in Puerto Rico, some local, some, from, out of jurisdiction. 2 filed on bankruptcy 2 months later. So that is a big lesson, right? And as of today, Maria happened in September 2017. We almost 9 years to go. They are state entities, state agencies. They are local governments and nonprofits that they haven't resolved their issues with the insurance company yet. And this is the important part. If FEMA estimates that in order to rebuild that building, it will cost $1 million. The equation is as a portion of that should be covered by the insurance. Another portion should be covered by FEMA in your federal share, right? Whether it's 90% or 75%. And the rest is going to be covered by the non-federal share. And in some instances, I remember in Puerto Rico, there was a project for a state entity, a state agency, a critical facility, forensic. The Forensic Health Institute, which is very critical, right? The estimates were $20 million to repair the entire building. And the insurance company should have contributed half of that. So what happened? They litigated, and they spent years litigating the case because the insurance company didn't want to pay the $10 million. 3, 4, 5 years later, they settled for $2 million. And FEMA needed to step up because if you demonstrate reasonable effort, then they will say, okay, I pay the difference. But now the Forensic Institute is on the hook for the obtain and maintain because they have to now have a proper coverage for $20 million for the next disaster if eventually will come to that. It is a real issue. And I'll say that there are options to deal with that. And one option is parametric insurance. And in Puerto Rico, we were able to work with FEMA, and we convinced FEMA to give us an opportunity to include as part of your insurance obtain and maintain parametric insurance. And we were able to convince them to actually get to the different levels and the thresholds for compliance over time, issuing cat bonds every year and trying to get to that level. And that's a good thing because now we have the rainy day fund for emergency work, and we have the catastrophic, the parametric catastrophic insurance for actual permanent work that will supplement insurance, and it will supplement whatever FEMA will obligate, down the road. So those are painful lessons learned, but there are ways to handle it. Just be mindful about the health of the insurance industry at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level.
Those are some excellent points. So we've looked a little bit about bringing money in, but what do we do when we need to do more with less? So what are the most overlooked cost-saving measures that we have that impact emergency management? I'm going to start off with Corey here.
I will answer fast because we're running out of time, but for us, it's shared platforms. We try to share platforms whenever we can with whoever's willing to share with us. But also, we created our own EMA dashboard. We created our own web EOC that the county shares. Outside of that, we try to do most of our trainings virtual, so we don't have to pay for travel fees, lodging, food, whatever we can do to save money. But I don't want to steal all your thunder, but we use our VOAD a lot. Outside of that, we use our faith-based network group that we set up to where we have pods all around the county, so that cuts employee costs. That cuts us actually having to bring employees in to work those places. But also we created or sub-created a cafe unit, which is community assistance and fire emergencies that will help whatever we need if we call. So those are some ways we have saved.
All right. I will add on to that. I think in the cost savings and efficiency sort of bucket in terms of preparedness, I think, adding on to the need to lean into the use of technology in ways that can drive efficiency and reduce workload. I think, in Miami-Dade, similar to your sort of VOADs and your groups there, I think use your community groups as force multipliers. So think about them as an opportunity to spread the messages that you guys have, to bring that preparedness out to your community, to amplify the work that you're doing as a way to reduce, the legwork that you guys have. But doing that is not just something that you give lip service to. It does require a lot of active engagement. Your groups are only going to be as valuable to amplifying your message as you are at engaging them regularly. We have a very active CERT team for the county. We train the municipalities so they can develop their own CERT teams. We have an MD core group, which is communities organized to respond in emergencies. That's all of our community-based, faith-based, nonprofit, NGOs. They're all part of that. We have a public-private partnership coordinator who works with our business community. We have a whole community planner who kind of hits everybody else who's not already covered. But these are groups that meet regularly. We offer trainings, we offer resources, we engage them so that we are pushing things to them, but also conversely, we're drawing out of them what are their capabilities, how can they be plugged in to help, and how can we actually leverage the community resources that we have at our disposal, so that, again, reducing the need for some of our government resources by seeing what we already have in our community.
Yeah, I think that we need to leverage more the nonprofits and the NGO community, because I know for a fact that there are a lot of nonprofits that are doing an excellent job working with government and local, state and local governments, even federal, associated with affordable housing in vulnerable communities. Right? There are good examples of that, and that takes pressure off the government in certain senses. Right? Number one. Number two, just today here we had a good representation from a local nonprofit in Puerto Rico. There were two ladies from Caño Martín Peña. Caño Martín Peña is a vulnerable community that has been struggling for decades just to have basic infrastructure capability, right? Stormwater, protecting mangroves, protecting green areas and what have you. Even dealing with water and sewer. They are a good example of a community that for years actually went to DC, went to Congress, and knocked on the doors year after year, and they were able to get appropriation approved through the Corps of Engineers to actually do meaningful projects in their community. And they were actively involved in seeking projects from FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grants Program 404, and combine it with CGD-MIT. They actually have three types of grants, one through the Corps of Engineers, one from HNGP, and one from CGD-MIT. It's a small group of people, but they're being very effective, very efficiently in obtaining those resources so they can actually train other organizations to become as effective as they have been. So I think, yeah, nonprofits are important, and they can be and they have been a very good partner for government.
So along the lines of efficiency, part of that is innovation. So how do you see emerging technologies impacting the field?
All right. So, I think this kind of goes along the lines of we need to find ways to get more money, obviously, for our programs, but also how can we find opportunities to need fewer dollars in the first place. I think that's a more sustainable path, since the first option is very fluid, but how can we do more with less, really do more with less? Some of the ways we are working at that, or a case study example that we're currently doing in Miami-Dade. So we've partnered with the Miami-Dade Innovation Authority, which is a third-party entity. It is not a county agency, but they work with county departments. And we were able to secure a spot for one of their public innovation challenges. We launched that in the fall. We are in the process of selecting the final winners now, but it's a good opportunity through an outside partner for us to find early to growth startup companies that work in technology who will come pilot their solutions for the county so that we can see if they work, see if these are things that we want to invest in. But doing it through this innovation challenge allows us to kind of try it before we buy it, because the innovation challenge, thankfully, they put all the money up for this. So they're making 3 separate $100,000 investments in these technology companies so that we have the opportunity to engage with companies that may not have a fair shot at open competition because they're smaller, get their foot in the door and get their platforms exposed, but also allow us to pilot solutions that we may not be fully committed to the idea of yet, but they may be leveraged to give us some benefits. So that's one of the things we're doing right now, is finding other creative opportunities to seek out things that will make our lives easier.
Some of the things we have done is just use AI. I'm not advertising, but EM1 is a very helpful tool for me. Not only has it helped me edit some of my plans, or it corrected some of the verbiage. It also checks if you have made sure you have met all the requirements for local and state. So that is one thing that I have done. And also, I'm not advertising again, Airtable is very good with doing the same thing. Airtable, that's where we created our web EOC. It's $288 a year, pretty much, versus $20,000 paying for web EOC. So AI for us has been a great tool.
All right. So as we get ready for our last question here for the panel, just want to do a reminder for everyone. Use the Mentimeter if you've got any questions you'd like to ask the group. But very briefly, keyword briefly, just wanted to ask each panelist, where do you see disaster funding evolving over the course of the next 10 years? I'm going to start with Corey.
Not to be the Debbie Downer, but I just I do not see it evolving at all. I just see it dwindling. Unfortunately, if you just take a look back in the last 5 years at some of the programs they have, most of them have disappeared. And at one point, hazard mitigation or any type of mitigation was on the table to be taken off. So I do not see it evolving. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you for those thoughts, Corey. Maggie, with a ray of sunshine, hopefully.
Oh, man, guys. Well, moderate sunshine, partly cloudy. So I think, we say it a lot, but all disasters are local. I think as we move into the next, 5 to 10 years, that will become less of a catchphrase and more of a reality, not just in the management of disasters, but the paying for disasters. So I think we need to really just embrace that as the new reality. All disasters are local to manage and to pay for. I think that's important. But with that in mind, we also have to be very proactive about building capabilities to meet that eventual need. So we have lots of jurisdictions who do not have enough staff, who do not have enough SMEs for certain critical tasks, who are over-reliant on the private sector, consultants and contractors to fill in gaps that should be a blue sky role. And so while we are seeing the dwindling of resources, we also have to take that opportunity to build our capabilities and our capacity internally so we are not left out in the cold when they eventually do get dwindled down, right? Or when critical programs like BRIC fail to come back, right? Because that's just kind of the direction we're trending. There's a very real desire, I think, to shrink the federal footprint and put more of the onus on local governments. And then I think as part of that, we also need to be more vocal in advocating for what we have to do and why these programs must be funded. I had a conversation with Jonathan Lord, who's hiding in the back, recently about this. But, we don't, like when people, I think we go into this a lot of times thinking like, oh, we've got to convince everyone that we need to be funded, we need to have a dedicated budget, la-di-la, right? But like how often do you just pull up what you are required to do as justification, right? What does it say in state statute is your responsibility? What does it say in your local ordinances that you must do? Those are all really good talking points for justifying the need for your programs and justifying the need for dedicated funding, because you can't have an unfunded mandate unless you're the federal government. You should not have unfunded mandates. If it says you must or you shall, that's your talking points to say, great, well, let's put some money into this program and let's make sure that we can sustain that absent federal resources.
So number one, I agree. Let's go back to pre-disaster mitigation. I hope that by understanding that you have to align incentives, I think everybody got that right from yesterday, with the proper federal officials and lawmakers, and maybe at the state level too, because you don't have to wait. I mean, it's sad that you have to wait until a disaster strikes and people die and property is destroyed and infrastructure is devastated to actually unlock billions of dollars in mitigation, right? So we should really invest before and then minimize the loss of life and property. That's number one. I hope that aligning incentives will make some sense out of it. Number one. Number two, emerging technologies. Here is my experience in disaster recovery so far. I have to deal with what is known as recovery support functions within the National Disaster Recovery Framework, or FEMA, which in essence is that you bring other federal agencies that are subject matter experts to deal with economic revitalization through EDA or energy projects through DOE or coastal management through NOAA, for example. I don't remember, maybe one or two exceptions. For the most part, I never really see any innovative proposal from the federal government through their recovery support functions. Nothing. It was pretty much more the same. With certain exceptions, I have to give kudos to FEMA, because I think we talked about this with NOAA yesterday. They were really thinking out of the box about approving, mitigation funds of Section 404 for coral reef restoration and conservation, because they realized that they could really look at or categorize a coral reef as a critical infrastructure. And it was the first time that they ever, look at that from that lens. I had to give kudos to FEMA, because that was an innovative way of trying to look at things. But sadly, it's the exception. I really saw very little of emerging technologies thinking out of the box kind of, approach of brainstorming when it comes down to recovery support functions. And number three, execution. My experience is that state agencies, they're not the best executing. I mean, all of a sudden you've given $2 billion to the Department of Education to rebuild schools. They don't know nothing about rebuilding schools. They know about academics. They don't know about rebuilding schools, right? That's just an example. In my experience, actually, most of the local governments, they do a pretty good job. If they have the capability, which you invest in capability and you invest in technical assistance, local governments are more effective. At least that has been my experience. And nonprofits, depending on the level of nonprofits, some are very effective, others need a lot of, hand-holding and technical assistance. So I think that from an execution standpoint, laws at the federal level and state level, they need to really think about what is the best way to execute actual recovery projects. Not every entity has the capability to execute it effectively.
All right, thank you for those thoughts. We do have a couple of questions here. So our first question is, there's a major gap in funding for preparedness activities. Thoughts on how best to address preparedness engagement with community partners? Who wants to take that? You can take this laptop, pass it down.
You want to go? I'll let you take the first one, because the second one is labeled. So I'll let you take the first one.
Well, he's already read the question. For preparedness engagement with community partners, for us, we just sent out a bunch of emails to just invite everybody to come and listen to us. We did that for about a week. Everybody just come to the EOC. We pitched how they could help and just gave them an email. If you want to help, here's an email, contact us back. Out of maybe the 75, 80 people that showed up, we had about 15 people that showed interest. And from there, we just, every month, we keep some type of communication, whether it's just sending them a one-pager to say, hey, this is what we're doing this month. If you want to be involved, be here, be ready to talk at this time. Outside of that, we have done outreach, not engagement, but outreach. And our outreach is simply just going to different stores or just sending out stuff through Facebook or Instagram to say, hey, this is what EMA is doing this month. Will you like to participate? If you want to participate, come here this date and we'll have conversations about it. So that's how our community engagement with partners have been.
Okay. I'll add one brief thing, and then I'll do the second question because it's labeled for Maggie.
Okay.
So, here, I'm just thinking, I'm just shouting into the void. Okay, so one thing I would add to that, in terms of, specific examples of preparedness engagement with our community partners, we do a number of planning exercises throughout the year. Some of those require stakeholder engagement. Some of our larger plans have requirements that we have active participation by, for example, the LMS plan all of our stakeholders to the LMS working group, anyone who would adopt it locally, they have to be an active contributor to that. That's a requirement. So that's one way. A lot of our plans require public feedback and comment periods, so those are distributed. We have other things, like we developed a strategic plan a couple years ago, and we did a lot of ground truthing with that to set our priorities. We developed our first ever flood response plan. I know, Miami, first flood plan, but we did that last year, and that was also a very active process, and we worked across all of the stakeholders who would have a role to play in a flood response, both inside the county and outside of the county. And so that is part of those like active engagement strategies, apart from the regular convenings of meetings and things like that. From like an individual level, we do a lot to train certain liaisons to other organizations so they can be force multipliers in a way that is well informed. Every year for like a month or so before hurricane season, we do what we call the trifecta training. So we do public trainings that we do virtually and in person in multiple languages related to our three major hazards, so heat, flooding, and hurricanes. And so that's like a regular public training and education campaign that occurs ahead of storm season. So there's a lot of ways, I think, to have that active engagement. Some of it is just pushing of information, messaging, information, and education, but a lot of that is bringing the community and your stakeholders to the table so that they can have a say in what you're doing, and they're, part of shaping that narrative.
Okay, this question is for Maggie. Can you speak more to your engagement in the legislative processes while also maintaining a public image of nonpartisanship/neutrality? There will be dragons ahead.
Well, just the facts, ma'am. I think that's how you maintain neutrality. I don't think that emergency management is inherently a partisan issue. I think we can all collectively agree on the need to safeguard and prepare our communities to be more adaptable and more resilient in the face of hazards. So I think in terms of engagement in the legislative process, I think you engage with everybody. This is politics neutral. So, sitting on legislative committees or being part of groups that discuss the future of our industry or any of these bills, I don't think no one's checking, voting records at the door. So I've never really found that to be necessarily a partisan issue for me. I suppose it could be maybe if you're like an elected official voting on a specific thing that's like highly charged, but as the emergency managers, we're more in the background. We're not necessarily standing at the podium, casting our opinions. We are the ones who are preparing the talking points and developing the pros and cons lists and giving recommendations about how it would tangibly impact the work that we do, how it would either help or hinder our primary missions. And I think if you approach it from that perspective, it's not really a political question so much. You kind of just stick to what it will do or not do from a fact-based perspective. So yeah, I think that's kind of the main take on that.
All right, well, that's our time. So thank y'all very much for your attention, and thank you for the panelists.